Okay, last Wednesday night, I kind of hurried through the end of chapter 9, and just want to kind of touch base, or at least go back and kind of clarify some things. I felt like when I was running through it, I didn't make myself too clear about what Paul was saying about beating the air, and just thought I'd kind of touch on that, and then we'll get into chapter 9. But as Paul was talking about gaining the incorruptible crown, he said that he had to bring his body into subjection. And he kind of compares it to the individual that runs a race or is engaged in a fight. And if he intends to win it, he's going to condition himself to the point that he's going to win it. And when he says it, when he talks about running the race, and then he kind of jumps over to engaging into a fight. And he says, I'm not like one who beats the air. That is a person that's not trained to actually become a fighter. It kind of reminds me of the old Three Stooges when old Curly would sit there and kind of do like this. You know, that's what he's talking about. He just, a person that's not trained to do it. Versus someone like, you know, years ago, Mike Tyson, you know, the one punch fight. People would pay big dollars to go watch Mike Tyson, and within 5 seconds his opponent was knocked out on the floor. He had trained himself and conditioned himself to the point to where he was pretty much invincible in the ring. And that's what Paul is trying to say here, is that he's not a person that's like a fighter beating the air. He's just, he's trained, he hit his opponent and knock him out. And that's the way he wants us to be. A person that runs a race, he's not going to be the individual that's going to sit around and eat donuts and bacon and cheese hamburgers all the time. Because a person like that is not going to be able to run a marathon. He's going to condition himself. He's going to put into his body what is necessary to ensure that he's got peak performance. So that's kind of what Paul was saying here when he was talking about striving for the crown. And the analogy is that we, in like figures, should build ourselves up in faith and the knowledge of Christ, so that we are able to convince others and also to be able to overcome the temptations when we're confronted with them. So now Paul gets into chapter 10, and kind of feeding off this, he goes into the discussion about Old Testament examples and why they, as children of God, failed before God. And it's kind of the same scenario here. Paul had made a statement about his ability to strive for a crown, and now he's using some example of people that had every opportunity and then threw it all away. And that's what we need to focus on today. So, this is going to be one of those days. I need to turn this thing on, I guess. And it's still not going to work. It's going to be one of those days where I won't have to touch it. There we go. So as we get into this chapter, we saw that Paul shows the importance, that we were talking about in chapter 9, self-denial and serving Christ, buffeting our bodies, making it acceptable for the service of Christ. He talked about in matters of liberty, such as eating meat sacrificed to idols, self-denial. It was necessary if by eating self-denial is necessary if by eating it would lead a brother to weak to stumble. We saw that back over in chapter 8. Or if some action would be if some action would be misunderstood and hinder the cause of the gospel, like receiving support from Corinth, which Paul had denied himself. We talked about that in chapter 9. So chapter 8 was the problem of eating meats to the idols and how it could possibly cause a brother to stumble. And if that was the case, not going to do it. I don't want to be the reason for him to lose his salvation. Chapter 9, we talked about the pattern of self-denial and how Paul put himself in service of all men, and that he would do anything, even including self-sacrifice for the service of Christ. And in doing that, make yourself as an invincible warrior as you can with the gospel for this fight. So even if some of the action was misunderstood, like receiving support of the gospel, we talked quite a bit about that last Wednesday. If that were the case, I will not receive it. In fact, Paul, I think, more than likely refused any support that was not deemed necessary. Now, the third reason as we get into this chapter is now, for self-denial, is now introduced. And that is, if indulgence imperils one's soul, do not walk on the edge. In other words, we have people that they want to get as close as they can to the sinful world and be content with what's over there, and then try to live for Christ, but you're like walking the precipice, and you're going to very easily stumble and fall off into the canyon or wherever it may be and lose your life. Tempting to live as close to sin without falling. That's why he says, if any man thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. And to make this point, he begins to cite several examples. And this is something that we all need to think about when it comes to when we think that we're walking in God's sight faithfully. We need to think, when we get to the point that we're self-confident of that, then that's the time we need to really be aware that our self-confidence could lead us into destruction. Now, some preliminary thoughts on all of this. In this chapter, Paul is dealing with the question of eating meat which has been offered to idols. This is still the discussion. All of this is kind of a large, topic that he's talking about. But this particular passage deals with overconfidence in some of the Christians, verses 1 through 13. Now, from the start of this letter, to try to keep it all into focus of what we're looking at here. If you remember when we started this letter, we saw where the Corinthians had a problem with following different men. They were divided over who they were going to follow. The guy I follow is much better than this guy. No, this guy's much better than those two guys. And then someone would say, well, I'm following Christ, and the rest of these guys doesn't stand up to his standards, so why follow them? And we saw, when we went through that discussion, why that was misleading. So they had a problem with overconfidence. And their overconfidence in their knowledge and their standing in God and freedom what to do what they liked. And kind of give you some ideas. We go back and look at some of these verses. In chapter 3, verse 18, he said, let no one deceive himself. If any among you think he is wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. Confidence in your ability to, or at least confidence in your knowledge that you're more intelligent than the next guy, you need to be careful. Then he says in chapter 4 and verse 8, you are already full, you are rich, you are reigned as kings without us, and indeed I wished you could reign, that we also may reign with you. You see, they had a problem with, we're much better than all these other people. They had confidence in their standing with God. And then he says in chapter 5 and verse 2 about the situation of incest, he said, if you are puffed up and have not rather mourned that he who has done this deed not be taken away from you. See, self-confidence that they were right and everything that they were doing was perfectly great in God's sight. So, Paul is now beginning to kind of focus back in on one of their consistent problems of arrogancy. So, from their point of view, think about this, from their point of view, their point was that they were spiritually safe. We've been baptized, we are one with Christ, we have partaken of the Lord's Supper, and therefore we've partaken of the body and the blood of Christ. We are in Christ, Christ is in us, therefore we are quite safe. We can eat meat offers to idols and take no harm. There is no possible danger that can happen to us. Now, does that sound like some of the self-confidence we see in the Lord's church today? I think sometimes we do. I think we take confidence in the fact that I've been baptized, that the Church of Christ teaches what is found in the Bible, and we take the Lord's Supper every Sunday, we give of our means, we sing songs, therefore I'm safe. I've partaken of the body, I've done all these great things Christ wants me to do, I'm safe, nothing's going to happen to me. That is the first time when you get that complacent in your life, like old Captain Picard said one time when he first met the Borg, he said what we needed was a good, quick kick in our complacency, a swift kick in our complacency. And that is sometimes we need to realize that, you know, when we think we're confident and we're safe and we're in good standings, that's when we need to be aware that there's a bigger danger out there than we're confident of overcoming. Rachel?
We're also taught if we don't stand strong in our faith, we can fall away.
We can fall
If we
away.
don't return to God, then yeah, we can be lost and living our life, you know, trying to stay in that way is, it can all be taken away from us.
We can. So, in the last point of this, these thoughts, so in this passage, Paul warns the people who are speaking with confidence and with the danger of overconfidence. So, let's take a look at chapter 10, and the chapter itself. Let's just take a look at the chapter itself. Yes, sir.
So wasn't Paul kind of confident whenever he said, I have fought the fight, I have finished it, the faith, I've kept the faith, however it goes.
Yeah, I fought the fight. I ran the course.
You know, that's how I feel that I'm supposed to be, but sometimes I feel like, you know, maybe I'm kind of walking down that fence a little bit too much.
Right. Paul had the confidence that what he was doing was what God wanted him to do. I mean, I don't think there was any doubt in his mind that he was running the course Christ wanted him to run. He was fighting the fight that he wanted him to fight. But still, he said, I have to bring myself into subjection lest after I've converted all these people, I myself should be lost. So he understood that the path he was on was right, but it was a path that may be right, but you have to be aware of the dangers around you and try to continue to remain on that path. So yes, we have the confidence in the promises of God, but these promises can be taken from us. And that's what he tries to illustrate here in these first 13 verses. So when we look at the chapter as a whole, in verses 1 through 13, we see Old Testament examples of the children of God who fell to temptation. 14 through 22, which we'll talk about next Sunday, you can partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons, or you cannot partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons. And then finally, 23 through 33, give all glory to God and give no offense to the church. So, the children of God can be cast off. And I think these are valuable lessons to learn. Now, Paul begins by saying, moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that our fathers under the cloud all passed through the sea. Now, Paul is bringing up Old Testament examples that the Jewish brethren in Corinth would understand. Those that came from Judaism into Christianity, they knew these stories from days gone by. Those that were of paganism, the Greeks, the Romans, those people, they probably weren't quite familiar with these stories. But as the brethren became, from the two different worlds came together into Christ, I'm sure the Jews were teaching them about these events. And now Paul is also teaching them also. So when he says, I do not want you to be unaware that our fathers under the cloud, that he was just specifically talking to the Jews himself, but it was encompassing both the Jews and the Greeks. He says, they were all baptized in Moses in the cloud in the sea, all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now, he says in verses 1 through 4, that Israel had been delivered from bondage, and they were brought into a fellowship with Christ, just like we are today. Those that were outside the body of Christ in baptism, they are brought into Christ. Now, the baptism that he talks about, he talks about it in verses 2. He says they were baptized into Moses, into the cloud, and in the sea. Now, he's referring back to the Red Sea being divided, and then they were overshadowed by the cloud that led them. So water's on the side, Christ on top. It's a symbolic, metaphorical reference to baptism that we today have been subjected to. Will?
I was going to mention in Matthew 16:18, where it talks about that upon this rock I will build my church, you know, the Catholic religion believed that Peter was that rock. Well, chapter 4 says, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ.
Right.
So, you know, they misapply that.
Yeah, our Catholics have a little problem with that. In fact, I've been to the Vatican a couple of times, and they've got Peter's tomb right there in the big middle of it, and the church is built on top, and there's a staircase going. I tell you, whoever that guy is in that glass and container, I don't know who he is, but he's probably thankful he's got a great burial place. I mean, it's lined with gold and drapery and done up great. But yeah, they said that particular Vatican, the church was built upon Peter, and there was Peter underneath that foundation when they began to lay it.
Teddy,
Or I'm gonna say there was a guy under that foundation when they laid it. They claimed it was Peter.
we went through there too, and Hayden was probably about 8, yeah. And he was not happy that we were there. He's like, we're not Catholics, why are we here? And we had a private tour guide so we could get through there pretty quick, and, you know, you see the one that's mummified, that they
Yeah.
said will never, you know, deteriorate and all that. He's seeing all that, he's just frustrated, and I said, well, what's your problem? He said, well, this is not what we believe, why are we here? And I said, well, you know, Mr. Mark was Catholic, and Mr. Will was Catholic, and I said, this is history. And I said, you'll have friends your whole life that'll be Catholic, and you can say, hey, I've been there, and I know how you believe and all that. He said, well, I just have one question. I said, what's that? He said, well, if they think the Pope is God on earth, why has there been so many of them?
That's a good
I still haven't had anybody be able to answer that question.
And that's a good statement. So anyway, they said that they ate of the same manna from heaven, and they all drank of the drink which came from the rock. And the rock that followed them was Christ in verse 4. Now, what we see is that Paul is making reference to the rock that is made in the Old Testament. And we look at 3 of the verses that we have. He says, for I proclaim in the name of the Lord, this is Deuteronomy chapter 32, 3 through 4. He says, ascribe greatness to our God. He is the rock. His work is perfect. All of his ways are justice. Then in Deuteronomy 32, 15, he says, and scornfully esteem the rock of his salvation. 32 verse 18, of the rock who begat you, who you are mindful and have not forgotten the God who fathered you. So we see that the rock being referred to in the Old Testament as a rock that is perfect, rock that is their salvation, the rock who begat them, the rock who provided for them. And so Paul is now saying that that rock was Jesus Christ. In fact, we know that the creation was through the work of Jesus Christ. So he says, even though they were baptized into Moses, they all had the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, they all drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, which was Christ. He said, but most of them God was not well pleased, and their bodies were scattered in the desert. So what are we seeing? We're seeing that people that were that had done everything that God wanted them to do, they were in favor with God, but fell out of favor with God. So he's teaching them these dangers. Paul did not want to be unaware of them. Those that were baptized in Moses, fed by Christ, were cast off from God. Now many of the Israelites were overthrown in the desert. You see this in verses 5 through 10. He says all appeared 5 times in the first few verses here. He says they all stood in the same spiritual favor with God. All these privileges Israel possessed, and in spirit of them they fell. Paul was drawing a parallel to warn the Corinthians. We must understand the temptations and failures which Paul points out in the context that he shows us, warns us of those practices. So when we see the word all, they all had this, they all did this, there was nobody left out. I mean, they were a family to God. So now Paul begins to enumerate in verses 5 through, or at least 6 through 10, the 5 sins that Israel were guilty of while they were in the desert following Christ. The first of these was lusting after evil things in verse 6. Worshiping idols, verse 7. Sexual immorality, verse 8. Putting God to the test, verse 9. And then verse 10, grumbling. So he says in verse 6, reading, he says, now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters, here's the second one, as were some of them, as it was written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Thirdly, nor let us become commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Here's the next one. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some also tempted and were destroyed by the serpents. Here's the next one. Nor complain, as some of them complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So now we're facing the end of the world, or the last days before the coming of Christ. Let's go back and review what these Israelites did as God took them under his wing, so to speak, provided for them and protected them and gave them everything they needed. And yet this is what they did. They committed all these things. So let's take a look at some of these examples. Numbers chapter 11, 4 through 3, and I doubt if I'll read the whole thing, but maybe. He says, now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense cravings. So the children of Israel also wept and said, who will give us meat to eat? You remember God provided them manna to eat for 40 years? Can you imagine eating the same thing over and over and over and over every day, 3 times a day? You know, I like broccoli. First time I ate it was when Janelle cooked it for me one time. And 47 years later, I kind of burnt out on it. I'll eat it because she cooks it, but I'm burnt out on broccoli. So I can understand how these people would be after so much time in the desert eating the same thing. But anyway, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. They were thinking about all these tasteful things. But now our whole being is dried up, and there is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. And then Moses says, where am I to get meat to give these people to the Lord? For they weep all over me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. So God gave them the meat, verse 33. But while the meat was still in their teeth before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. So the grumbling doesn't, lusting after evil things doesn't help. Worshipping idols. Remember Aaron and the golden calf? While Moses was up in the mountain, people were complaining, and finally Aaron gave in to him and said, give me the gold from your hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. And they said, this is our God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And Aaron made an altar before the God. So they went from God's blessings now into idolatry and following the idol that they had made, saying that it was the God of heaven. So the third thing is the sexual immorality in Numbers 25. And he says, now Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to their sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. And those who died, in verse 9, in that plague were 24,000. And then we see putting God to the test, Numbers 21. And the people spoke against Moses, against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread, the manna. Wonderful blessings from God they call worthless. So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the Israelites died. Putting God to the test. And then finally grumbling, Numbers 16. And they gathered against Moses and Aaron and said, you take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? Well, because God put them there. So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the congregation, no, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the congregation, saying, get away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. These were the guys that were spearheading this complaint. And now it came to pass, as he finished speaking all these words, that the ground split apart under them, and the earth opened up his mouth and swallowed them up, with all their households, and the men of Korah, and with all their goods. So these people perished at the hand of God. And the interesting thing about this is that the very next day, here they come back to Moses complaining again about basically the same thing. So they didn't learn the lesson the first time, they had to get it the second time. And I think maybe at that point they got the idea that you are not going to grumble and put God to the test. So these are the sins of Israel that we see listed in these first 10 or 11 verses. So, the consequences of unbelief and belief. Now, we have to be aware that, sometimes our belief can become complacent to where it actually begins to become unbelief. Self-assurance and God's happy with us, and now our belief may be to the point where I don't have to believe much anymore because I'm confident in the way I'm doing things. Unbelief, which is lack of trust. That is, God denied them his promise. Belief is unwavering trust. And when you have unwavering trust, God will grant them his promise. These were the lessons that we can learn from these people wandering in the wilderness. When their belief and lack of trust in God failed, they were denied his promises. In fact, when we look at Numbers 14 and verse 22 and 24, when Moses sent spies into the promised land to see, kind of scope out the area and kind of plot a course of entry into the land and overcoming the nations. He says, because all these men, that is the men that went with Caleb and Joshua, all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness. These people had been from the very first time the plagues happened in Israel, the Red Sea, the wanderings and the things that happened in the desert. Now they're at the borders of the promised land. He says, all these people, they've seen my glory, they've seen the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice. They certainly shall not enter the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. Now, and the reason for this is because these men that went with Joshua and Caleb into the promised land said, they're too big, they're too powerful, they're too strong, there's no way in the world that we can overcome these people. They lost their confidence in God. Now God's reminding them, you've seen what I've done from the very beginning, the time I brought you out of bondage until now, and you still doubt my ability to give you the promised land. So now he's saying, you've been rejected, you will not see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him. Now there's a kicker right there. Caleb and Joshua had different spirits. They saw the obstacles, they saw how big they were, but they were confident that because of what God had proven to them in the past, he can now prove for them in the future. He had no doubt in his mind. He had a different spirit in him and has followed me fully. I will bring him into that land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. So, do we ever lack confidence that God is doing what he's promised for us? If you do, think about what happened to the Israelites. They didn't enter the promised land. Full confidence, I run the course, I fought the fight. He's got the confidence of what God has done for him, what he will do for him, and what I can gain from all of this, eternal rest with God in heaven, versus grumbling and having doubts that I can overcome certain things. Now we begin to find ourselves doubting God's ability to protect his children. And when that happens, we run the possibility of losing our inheritance. Don't ever doubt God and what he's going to say and do for us. A lot of people will say, I've prayed and I've prayed and I've prayed for this affliction to be taken from me, or to help me through some troublesome times in my life, and he doesn't seem to answer my prayers. Maybe he's not answering them the way that you think that he should answer them, but he is answering your prayers. He's giving you the ability, the confidence, or giving you the ability to trust in him and have confidence in him to deliver you in the last day. You know, this whole journey through earth is a trial for us, I guess you could say, to show our worthiness to God. You know, let's face it, that's what it is. If we're worthy, he will give us eternal rest. If we're not worthy, then we will not have that. And we think about life as being, you know, if we live to be 100 years old, that's a good long life. Well, that's just, you know, a blink compared to eternity. So we can endure these years if we work at it and we have the right frame of mind. But if we don't, then we could very well wind up like these people that refused to follow Joshua and Caleb into the promised land. So if any man thinks he stands, let him take heed lest he fall, 11 through 13. Now, Paul concludes this section by saying three things about temptation. Well, let's see. He says, therefore, in verse 12, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except as such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. So Paul concludes the section by saying three things about temptation. First of all, he's quite sure that temptation will come and that it is part of the essence of life. Paul didn't say it may come, he says it's going to come. Temptation is what makes life what it is. It's what hardens us. Any temptation that comes to us is not unique. It's not unique to any individual. Everybody is going to be tempted by the same things, but maybe in a different form. You know, it's kind of like a piece of carpenter's wood. You know, maybe you may have a piece of pine, may come in a 2x4, 2x12, or 2x6, whatever it may be. It may come in a sheet of plywood. That's the way temptations are. It's going to be wood. It's going to be there, and it's going to be for a particular area of temptation, but it may approach you in different ways. But when there's temptation, there is always a way of escape. Now we got to remember, there's, you know, if we just take the time to think about it and reason what we're up against, we can escape it. But if we just run headlong into it like a wide open freight train, then you know you're gonna fall to the temptation. Now, in conclusion of all of this, what we see is that old phrase that we've heard so long, you know, all of our lives. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Paul did not want these people, especially the Jews and the Jews teaching the Greeks, don't forget your history. Look what happened to them, it can happen to you. If you forget your history, you're going to repeat it all over again. But if you remember your history, then you won't make the same mistakes these people made. And that's a lesson a lot of people needs to learn in life. We should learn from other people's mistakes and their successes. If you see someone that made a big blunder, don't do what he's done. If someone has been extremely successful in life, you know, from a material standpoint, hey, it may be a good idea to follow this guy. You know, he's done well, maybe I can do, you know, maybe just as well or maybe even better. Who knows? We should learn from other people's mistakes and their successes. We should never take God for granted. You know, sometimes I think we do take God for granted. But we should never do that, because when we do, then our expectations of what we should receive when times get hard begins to make us lose trust in God. If we have peaceful and prosperous in life with plenty of food on the table, and all of a sudden, boom, we have a depression like we had back in the 20s or the 30s. People didn't have jobs, they didn't have homes to live in, they didn't have food, they were destitute. My dad told me, he said that was some of the most horrible times that he had to live through. And when people have this peace and prosperity and all of a sudden it's taken away from them, they begin to complain to God that it's your fault that I'm this way. So we should never take God for granted. We should always be aware of the temptations and look for that way out. It is there. And finally, temptations are not designed to make us fall, but they're designed to make us stronger. And if we remember that, and we have these temptations, and we come overcome it, then we can say, yes, I gave it to Mike Tyson punch. Knocked him out the first time around. And we can become stronger, and the next time that particular type of temptation comes to us, we can do it again because we've learned how to overcome it the first time. So anyway, any comments? Any questions? Did I miss anything?
I got a question.
Okay.
You brought up an interesting point about walking down a fence, you fall this way, you fall that way. I wonder if there's a correlation between walking down the fence versus somebody that reads his Bible every day and prays every day. Does that help him to stay off that fence? Versus somebody who maybe he reads his Bible maybe once a week or something like that? It just seems like if you're in the Word more, it ought to keep you off that fence.
Kind of give you an example. I was a machinist for 15 years. Good one too, by my own standards. Sir, okay, now, if you were to put me in front of an engine lathe today, I don't think I would know how to set the machine to cut a thread. Or I don't remember the speeds that I would need to have to do the rough cuts, the finish cuts. You know, a lot of that stuff I've already lost because I haven't done it for, 30 years. So yes, the more you have your head in the book, the more that you're going to learn about God, and the more you're going to learn what He wants us to be. It's kind of like when you study Paul's life. We think Paul was an apostle, he wrote the letters, and so forth, he established churches. But when you begin to examine what he's saying and the way he says some things, you begin to see the man himself and the way he thinks, the way he lived, and the way he wanted other people to be. Because he knew that as he followed Christ, if they followed him, they would be on the road to success. That's why I said last Wednesday night, look at all the people that made it to heaven. If we understand their lives and their attitude of heart and their integrity and do the same thing, if they made it to heaven, then we're probably on the right road. And that was, to me, an eye-opener, just something that kind of made me stop and think. So Paul, it's like you said, the more we have our head in the book and the more that we look and understand the man, then the more we can become in tune with him. Same thing with the Word of God. The more that we understand what God expects of us as His children, the more that we can become like His children. If you don't read it, then you're making one of the biggest mistakes in your life. You could find yourself straddling that fence and all of a sudden falling the other way. And don't be like the cow that sticks his head through the fence to try to get the grass on the other side. You've heard that story? And sometimes it gets that head stuck and you can't get it out. Well, that's the way we don't want to be. Thank you for your time and your attention.